Turn the fan down a little, so it's a little high. It's all right for everyone. Yeah. There are two stories. First story is about a young man who was about to be married. He was born at a time and into a faith where marriages were arranged, so he had never met his bride. But as he was sitting in his house, waiting for the time to come when he would stand under the marriage canopy, as he was gazing out of the window, a face appeared in the window, a beautiful woman, and their eyes met, and her gaze was very alluring. And he thought to himself, "Oh, I hope my bride-to-be is as beautiful and alluring as this woman." And a wave of desire rose up within him. The time came for him to stand under the wedding canopy with his bride. But as the ceremony was taking place, he glanced around, and there was the woman again, and their eyes met again. And then his eyes moved to another place, and there she was again, their eyes meeting. After the ceremony, when he went into the wedding chamber, instead of his bride, there was the woman who had appeared in the window and on the outskirts of those gathered at the wedding. And he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am the daughter of Lilith." Now Lilith is known as the wife of Satan. So according to the young man's faith, he was afraid. He knew that his soul was in danger. But just at that moment, she dropped her garments. So a wave of desire washed over him, to which he succumbed, and they met in embrace. This went on for some time, but deep inside himself, the young man knew that this was not his true bride, and he resolved to escape. But during the course of their lovemaking, he had asked her, "Where are we?" And she replied, "We are in the palace of illusion." Now the young man did escape from this place, but he found himself wandering aimlessly, trying to find where his true bride was. He came to unfamiliar places until finally he arrived at a village that seemed to have a familiarity about it. So he went from door to door to door, asking, did they know his bride? But no one knew of her, even though he knew her name. Finally, he came to a house and he knocked on the door. And someone said, "Come in." And when he entered, there was the daughter of Lilith, lying on the lounge, and he knew he was still in the thrall of desire. In that moment of recognition, he found himself standing under the canopy beside his true but unknown bride. And after the ceremony, as was a custom, a cup was broken, and the young man, after breaking the cup, trod on its pieces, imagining them as the palace of illusion. That evening, when he united with his true bride, he clung desperately to that which he had found. Second story is about a young man who was a seeker after truth and enlightenment. And he'd studied the ancient books and read the text of the masters. He'd practiced the rituals and the practices. But he felt that his knowledge was not complete. He did not have a knowledge of the arcane, the magic. So he resolved to find a wizard, a sorcerer, who would teach him the arcane arts. So he set out on his quest. And in his travels, he came to a river that he had to cross in a ferry boat. And whilst he was on the ferry, he got in conversation with a certain merchant. And in their conversation, he related to the merchant what it was that he was seeking. And the merchant said, "Oh, I know a wizard. He's where we're going. I'll introduce you to him. I'll give you his address. I'm sure he'll be willing to teach you what it is that you want." So when they arrived on the other side of the river, the merchant gave him the address of his wizard friend and pointed him in the right direction. But when the young seeker came to the house of the wizard, he was very much surprised. It didn't look like a wizard's house. And when the door was opened, the man who answered certainly didn't look like a wizard. He didn't have any wizard's hat. He wasn't wearing a cloak of any kind. He was just an ordinary kind of man. But the man invited him in and asked him the reason for his coming. And the young man told him that he was wanting to find a wizard, a sorcerer who would teach him the arcane arts. And he'd been introduced by a certain merchant. And the man said, "Well, that merchant is my friend, and indeed I am a wizard." Well, the young man kind of shook his head and didn't want to be impolite, but said, "Well, really, I was after a young man who was, of my age." And and of course the wizard completely knew that the young man wasn't believing what he was saying, that he was indeed a wizard. But the wizard said, well, come in, it's late in the evening now. Please join me for an evening meal. So while the wizard was off preparing a repast for them, there was a knock on the door. And the wizard said, "Would you please answer that door for me while I'm busy stirring the rice?" And so the young man walked towards the door. But as he was walking towards the doorway, there in front of him was a great abyss. And before he knew it, he'd stepped into the abyss and found himself whirling and whirling and whirling and whirling and whirling down until he finally came to rest. And looking around, he found himself in a very strange place, a place he'd never seen before. A city, no doubt, but the people were dressed differently, they were acting in different ways. And shaking his head, he decided that he would go and ask where he was. And when he asked someone, and they named this place, it was completely unknown to him. And when they asked him where he was from, and he answered, they said, "Oh, we've never heard of this place. Never. Where is that?" So the young man was completely confused and quite addled. But along the road, in a kind of marketplace, there were a lot of scribes. So obviously in this place, there were those who were scribes and translating, sending letters, preparing. And so the young man went up to one of these scribes and said, "Well, I can read and write, but I'm in this strange place, so I wonder, will you write a letter for me?" And the scribe said, "Well, if you can read and write, write something for me." So the young man wrote out one of the writings of his faith and time, and the scribe was completely surprised at the beauty of his script. "Oh," he said, "I've never seen a script like this. Oh, our king would be greatly, greatly pleased to see your work." So the young man was taken off to the king, and he was shown his script. "Oh," said the king, "I've never seen script like this. You have to become my scribe. So the young man was put in the employ as a scribe to the king, and after some time he became quite an advisor to him. But then the young man grew quite lonely and longing for his home. So he spoke to the king, and the king said, "Oh, I've grown very fond of you. Please stay. I'll give you my daughter's hand in marriage." Well, of course, the young man could not refuse this offer. The princess was a very beautiful and gracious being. So they were married, and they had 2 children. But one day, when the young man was outside, his children were playing, his son ran off, and suddenly he saw his son fall into the well. So he chased and dived into the well to save his son. And he whirled and whirled and whirled. And finally, he found himself back in the sitting room of the wizard. And the wizard said to him, "Well, have you discovered something about the arcane laws?" The young man was still in that adult state. He said, "No, I've been an advisor to the king. I had 2 children and a wife I loved." And the wizard said, "You've been away just but a moment." The young man suddenly realized the way of magic, the way of illusion, and asking the wizard, the sorcerer, humbly, "Can I become your student?" And indeed, he did and completed that which it was that was his desire to obtain and attain, the way of magic, the art of illusion. What is the relationship between these two stories? What does it bring up for us in awareness? Where do they meet? What is the thought or the awareness that arises out of the chemistry of these two stories?
The nature of illusion.
The nature of the
illusion.
Illusion, right. The nature of illusion. When it said, anything that changes is not real. Anything that changes is not real. So the question arises, when everything in life is change, what is real? What is unchanging in our life? The real and the unreal. Thank you.